First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here, and especially welcome Dr. and Mrs. George Beadle. And Mrs. Muriel Beadle will be speaking today. And before she speaks, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about her. She was fashion editor for Los Angeles Mirror News. She has written 4 books, one of which is available in our bookstore, entitled The Child's Mind. She has also written These Ruins Are Inhabited, Where Has All the Ivy Gone? And she's co-written with her husband, Dr. George Beadle, The Language of Life. And today she will be speaking Where It All Begins, the development of the political awareness of the preschool child. And since I'm sure you want to hear her, let's now do, because she's a fantastic lady.
Thank you. That was a nice introduction, but it wasn't quite downbeat enough. So now I have to define myself for all of you. Maybe some of you saw an article that I wrote in the New York Times Magazine last October about about first names. Did any of you read that? It was called The Game of the Name. Anyway, it was an article that had to do with really the psychology and the sociology of naming. What does the first name mean to the person who gives it? What does it mean to the person who bears it? It wasn't a terribly difficult article to write because once you skip all the anthropological literature about giving names in so-called primitive cultures, there's very little literature left on psychology and sociology of naming in the modern Western industrialized nations. So really in doing this, I had read everything that was listed in the periodical guide or the social service guide, and I probably knew as much about the psychology and sociology of naming as anybody in the country. Well, after the article ran, among the communications I got was one from ABC in Cleveland or Cincinnati. And the young lady who was obviously the promotion or on the producing staff of this show said, Mrs. Beadle, that was a perfectly marvelous article in the New York Times about names, and we think it would make a great spot interview on our ABC TV morning show. And I said, yes. And she said, do you have a university affiliation? And I said, no, I'm a writer. And she said, well, are you an educator? And I said, no. She said, well, are you a psychologist? And I said, no. She said, well, Mrs. Beadle, could you suggest to us an expert who could come on our program and do this interview about names? So what I did, of course, was to suggest the individuals whose research I had reported in this article that I had either had direct contact with or I knew or for some reason I thought were articulate enough to be on the program. So I said, well, these are the people you might get in touch with so that they could have a bona fide expert. Now, I tell you this anecdote so that I can introduce myself as a non-expert coming to talk to you today on a subject which I wrote a book about because it's my theory. I understand I'm meeting with some journalism people tomorrow, that any writer can write about anything if that person is intelligent and does proper research. And this paper is drawn in part from A Child's Mind, which those of you who have read it know has to do with the mental development of children, but it goes beyond that. And it really is not, and it's an open-ended paper, and I hope that it'll take maybe 30 minutes, and that after that we can have general discussion if you want to. Cliches become cliches because when they are fresh, they so perfectly capture a body of thought or sum up the mood of a period that everybody uses them. Familiarity in time breeds boredom, and eventually people respond to a cliche with a sort of ritualistic genuflection, but they no longer really hear it or reflect upon its meaning. And the field of human development abounds in cliches. One of them is this: the learning which occurs during the child's preschool years is the foundation of all subsequent learning. Now, I can't imagine anyone disputing that statement. And yet very few people act in accordance with what it says or what it implies. If they did, especially in light of new research which stresses the presence of a unique time factor in the learning process, there would be a shift in emphasis by everyone in the health, education, and welfare field, and that's a massive lot of people, to programs providing parental counseling from the time infants are conceived, or to the establishment of daycare or home visitation programs for babies whose parents won't or can't rear them properly. There would be sweeping changes in the approach of every social institution to such fundamental problems as compliance with the laws, stability of the family, the status and society of minority groups, and many other concerns that depend for their solution on the beliefs and attitudes of the general public. So I think it would be fun to examine, as if we were hearing it for the first time, the assertion that the learning which occurs during the child's preschool years is the foundation of all subsequent learning. That's what I tried to do in the book A Child's Mind, and my remarks today are sort of a postscript. When writing that book, and even more so afterwards when making speeches drawn from its content, I discovered that the word learning is used by many people in two different contexts and without real understanding of its basic meaning. Learning is correctly defined as a process which brings about a lasting change in an individual's behavior as a result of contact with the environment. Now, the process is the same whether one is referring to motor behavior, as in the phrase learning to walk, or to mental behavior, as when one says learning to read. Yet the word learning, when applied to mental activity, connotes to many people only the body of knowledge that one acquires, rather than the process by which one acquires it. Early learning in this context, therefore, is often thought of as precocious mastery of the alphabet, the ability to count, or similar academic skills. It's difficult for people who think this way to accept the assertion made by Benjamin Bloom that by the time a child enters first grade, he already possesses 1/3 of the academic skills he will have at age 18. It also astounds many people in the audiences I've talked to when I say that a child is developing academic skills when he piles a number of blocks into a pile, or stack. What he is learning is that height can be measured in equal-sized units. He is also learning an academic skill when his tower collapses and his mother says, "Oops, your tower fell down. Let's build it up again." Now, adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions express relationships between things and situations, and as a child hears them used in their proper context, he begins to acquire the concepts that they represent. He can't order his perceptions of the world around him until he has mastered such basic concepts as those of space and time and cause and effect. Early familiarity with block towers that fall down and which can be built up prepare him for a school teacher who tells him as he learns to read that one can distinguish the letter D from the letter P because D has a long line that goes up and P has a long line that goes down. It's because so many culturally deprived children do not hear language of this sort when they are 2 or 3 years old that Sesame Street scripts put so much stress on such pairings as near to, away from, in, out, over, under, and so on. Next, let's re-examine another word in the statement that the learning which occurs during the child's preschool years is the foundation of all subsequent learning. When applied to a building, the word foundation is accepted by everyone as a rigid base which has both supportive and limiting functions. Its size and its depth permanently affect the structure's shape and height. But in applying the same word to learning, foundation retains only the supportive connotation. Instead of a base, it becomes a core, and a rather fluid one at that. That this connotation is wrong is the main point of Benjamin Bloom's book, Stability and Change in Human Characteristics. How many of you have read it? The rest of you ought to join her. It's a difficult book to read, don't you think? I've never seen such dreadful social science jargon. But it's a most important book, published by Wiley in 1961, I think. Anyway, in this book, Benjamin Bloom says, I'm quoting now, "There is an implicit assumption running through our culture that change in behavior or personality can take place at any age or stage, and that the developments at any one age or stage are no more significant than those that take place at another. This is simply not so," he asserts, and he cites evidence from a great many studies which have followed the same children through the first 18 or so years of life. A basic finding is that various characteristics follow a developmental curve which accelerates very rapidly during the preschool years. For a physical example, take height. Boys gain 54% of their mature stature by age 3. I have already mentioned that 1/3 of the academic skills a person has at age 18, as tested by Say Vocabulary, has been acquired by age 6. As for personality development, of whatever degree of aggressiveness boys have at age 18, something like 50% has developed by age 3. The studies I'm citing do not study aggressiveness in girls, but passiveness. I spare you those statistics. Then the developmental curve in most cases that Bloom studied levels off. Boys gain 32% of their mature height between ages 3 and 12, and a final 14% between 12 and 18. The curve for academic skills is slower to decline. 42% develops between ages 6 and 13, and only 25% between 13 and 18. Now, each curve reaches a virtual plateau at some point quite early in life and thereafter stabilizes. Stabilize means doesn't change. Bloom grants the possibility that very powerful environmental and/or therapeutic forces may overcome and alter stabilized characteristics. All of us know of specific instances in which courses in remedial reading or psychiatric treatment have made it possible for people who were deprived or damaged in childhood to recover lost ground in adolescence or adulthood. The majority of people in a population, however, do not have very powerful environmental and/or therapeutic forces at work in their behalf. And for most of us, it remains true that the developmental events of our earliest years are not reversible and at best are only modifiable in later life. As for early learning, its great resistance to later change is explained by some theorists in terms of there being a right time for the child to learn certain kinds of things, a period when the maturing organism is uniquely sensitive to particular kinds of experience. And I'll give 2 examples. In most adults, the left hemisphere of the brain controls language use, and the right hemisphere controls such nonverbal activity as the ability to discriminate between shapes, colors, sounds, and textures. The information and the capabilities possessed by these 2 specialized hemispheres are normally shared by transmittal through this great bundle of nerves which joins the 2 hemispheres across the top of the skull. In very young childhood, however, and up until about the age of 4, the 2 hemispheres are unspecialized. If a child under 4 has an accident which damages the left hemisphere, he is much less likely than an older child or an adult to have permanently impaired speech. The two hemispheres seem to perform alike until their unique developmental timetable has been realized. And after that, each hemisphere loses its ability to do the specialized work that nature has assigned to the other. Now, a second example has to do with emotional development. There have been umpteen studies which show that it doesn't seem to matter tremendously how many people care for newborn babies, brand new babies. But between roughly 7 months and 2 years, a child needs one dominant nurturing figure. Even if a child acquires such a figure in his life after age 2, babies who have been cared for by a series of transient figures, as used to happen in orphanages and still does in city hospitals where children are abandoned, if a child, even if a child has been raised in that kind of a situation, been cared for by a series of transient figures, they are almost certain to exhibit emotional damage in maturity. Superficial and impersonal mothering in very young childhood reduces an adult's sense of personal identity and his ability to form satisfactory relationships with other people. There also seems to be a common sequence in the evolution of attitudes towards social institutions and towards social groupings other than one's own. A child's first job is to develop a sense of self. Only when he knows who I is can he begin to differentiate himself from others. This takes between 3 and 4 years, give or take, on the average. The next stage is to observe physical traits or external behavior in the people around you and compare them. By age 5, most children identify themselves and others as of a given race, using such criteria as skin color, hair color, and cast of features. Concurrently, although full awareness comes perhaps 2 years later, they have begun to value people differentially according to race. Awareness of religious or ethnic differences develops a bit more slowly, but the stages are the same as with racial awareness. First, the child has to place himself within a group. One study of 4-year-olds that I found especially charming, in which it was sought to determine their awareness of ethnic or religious identity, turned up some gloriously irrelevant answers by adult standards. When one child was asked, "Are you Catholic?" he answered, "No, I'm Richie." Another was asked, "Are you Jewish?" and he replied, "No, I'm 4. I'll get Jewish." A third, asked if she was an American, said, "No, my father is an American. I'm a girl." Incidentally, how many of you know Piaget's work? Well, you can see here the working out of the Piaget theory. You see that a child at this age, in 4 and 5, it has great difficulty thinking of 2 things at the same time. See, this just ran through this whole series of answers, in which if you're Richie, you can't be Catholic. If you're 4, you can't be Jewish. You see, it takes a while to get the idea across in handling of numbers and handling of volume and everything else that Piaget talks about. So I'm sure this is all part of the same thing. You have to work your way into this business if you can be 2 things at once. And these kids hadn't got to that point yet because they were 4. By the age of 5 or 6, however, the social group labels have begun to be grasped. And as with racial awareness, it is some concrete, easily observable external characteristic upon which the child bases his initial judgment. At the time that one of the best of these studies was made, the public schools were teaching primary grade children to print their letters, whereas the parochial schools were teaching script writing from 1st grade on. It was logical then that a 5-year-old should define Catholics as people who write and Protestants as people who print. Another child in the same survey equated Jewish with eating pickles. By age 7, however, The value system of the older generation has been learned, and a second grader will distinguish between two religious groups by saying, sometimes mothers don't like Protestants to play with Catholics. Now, the basic attitudes acquired toward other social groups do not change very much after second or third grade. So it's kind of silly to have brotherhood weeks in junior high school if one is assuming that one is going to affect fundamental changes in attitudes toward people of other races, religions, or ethnic groups. Now, what about political awareness? It didn't occur to me when I was doing the research for A Child's Mind, since my upper limit was about age 5 to 7, that there also might be an early stabilization of attitudes about the political regime. And it was only after my book was out that I discovered a monumental study, which was reported in book form, under the title of Children in the Political System, with the subtitle Origins of Political Legitimacy. Its authors are David Easton, who is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and Jack Dennis, who's a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin. Now, the topic is of great interest just now, with the Watergate scandal so much in the news, so I'm going to take the rest of my time to discuss in some detail the study which is reported in that book. I must warn you, however, that the study is now almost 15 years old, and that a similar one, if conducted today, might yield quite different results. And in fact, we can finish this meeting by guessing what the results might be if the study were to be repeated today. I should also say parenthetically that the head of the University of Chicago's Department of Economics, who was the dean of the Division of Social Sciences, at the time this survey was made, told me the other day that this particular survey caused a perfectly tremendous commotion. I mean, that at the time that it was made, I mean, an internal commotion, because it represented going into great numbers of schools, I'll tell you how many later on, in various parts of the country, without parental permission, and interviewing the children, talking with the children about their political attitudes toward things. And nowadays, Mr. Johnson tells me this would be an utter impossibility. I mean, you can't go into the schools and just use the kids as guinea pigs and say, what do you think about so-and-so? You have to ask parental permission, and this would have skewed this particular survey tremendously, because the only parents that would have given permission at that time, a lot of them were in an uproar, because they said it was too pro-Nixon or it was too pro-Kennedy, depending on which side of the fence they were already on. And nowadays, the only parents that would have agreed to this kind of a survey were those that were already politically conscious, and this would have skewed it terribly, you see. So he says this kind of a survey can probably never be made again. So so here we go. For a great many years prior to this and a slightly preceding survey, it was widely assumed that the best time to concentrate on education for effective participation in the political affairs of the nation was as young people approach voting age. And that assumption was blown sky high in the late 1950s when David Easton and Robert Hess, who was a psychologist then at the University of Chicago, studied the political attitudes of some 2,000 high school students in order to find out what changes occurred in their attitudes toward the political regime between the freshman and senior years in high school. And they discovered that virtually no change occurred. And later investigators have confirmed this finding. So, since the preteens seem to be the period in which attitudes toward the political system are formed, various investigators then shifted their attention to the elementary schools. And the study that I'm about to cite, the one that Gail Johnson says can never occur again, involved 12,000 youngsters in grades 2 to 8 living in different regions of the country. And this is the one that's described in the Children in the Political System, the book I mentioned. Now, up to about the 5th grade, these children saw the government as something intangible which, quote, hovers over the country and cares for it, unquote. This is a quotation from one of the researchers. Now, this something is personified by two human symbols, the policeman and the president. Of the two, very young children perceive the policeman more realistically when asked whether it was most wrong to disobey one's mother, father, teacher, or policeman. 75% of third graders picked the policeman. At the same time, 72% of them said that the policeman would always want to help me if I needed it. So it was clear that children are early aware of the twin roles of the police in our society. These children, I should add, because these children were all white children, and I will also remind you that this study was done in the early 1960s. Now, as for the president, they placed him somewhere between God and the angels. They thought he was infallible. 72% of fourth graders said that the president almost never or rarely makes mistakes. They thought him trustworthy. 68% of second graders said that, quote, he always keeps his promises, unquote. They believed him to be responsive. 75% of the same age group said that if they wrote to the president, he, quote, would care a lot, about what they thought. One child was asked, can you tell the president what kind of things he should do? And the child replied, yes, you just go to the White House. Most people do. These children had only a foggy notion of the nature and role of political parties and of the political process itself. The average third grader believed that competing candidates, in this case it was Kennedy and Nixon, never said anything bad about each other, and that the issues debated during an election campaign magically dissolve in a great wave of unity and cooperation when the defeated candidate and the victorious one engage in those ritualistic handshakes on the morning after. Now, the fifth grade is an intellectual watershed. Psychologists have pegged age 10 or thereabouts as the time when youngsters begin to think in abstract terms, and their understanding of political matters follows this pattern too. From fifth grade on, they are capable of comprehending the less personalized agencies of government. They begin to understand the role and operation of such bodies as Congress and the Supreme Court, and they transfer their high regard for the president as a person to the presidency as an office. By eighth grade, according to the 1960 survey I've been quoting, some disenchantment has occurred, but to a very small degree. 59% of 14-year-olds said that the government rarely or almost never makes mistakes, and 84% believed that the government usually knows what is best for the people. Now, these children, as I said earlier, were all white. They attended schools in stable urban or suburban districts. How would the children of subcultures whose adult members are distrustful of the political regime view the government? I know of no study of attitudes among black children, but a significant one was done in 1967 using 2,400 children in grades 5 through 12 in an Appalachian county where there is a great deal of overt anti-government sentiment among the adults. Whereas 57% of children in the East and Hess study believe that the president is more honest than most men, only 23% of the Appalachian children rated him so high. Whereas 82% of the children in the first study thought that the president knows more than most men, only 45% of the children in Appalachia agreed. It'll be interesting to see whether children born into mainstream American homes during the past decade will be as thoroughly sold on the political system as their predecessors have been. I hope that David Easton or some political scientist has been conducting a new study somehow or other attempting to determine this. And he hasn't been at the university this year, so I haven't attempted to update my information. If children's sense of trust in their government begins with a sense of trust in the president as a person, I don't see how the current distrust of President Nixon could fail to have some future impact on citizens' attitudes toward the legitimacy of our political system. Going back to the early 60s, children who were born in the early 60s are now at the age, are now in, well, what, post, just beginning the teenage period. Their political attitudes are all formed. What would those political attitudes have been with the multiple assassinations and the turmoil in the country through the 60s? I don't know, but I think this is a fascinating thing to consider. To what extent do the traditional ways of raising children, the traditional textbooks, the traditional school attitude, how important is that set against what you see on your television set at night? And I have no way of knowing how to evaluate the relative effect of these really opposite viewpoints. Because I know the schools. How many of you in the School of Education? Nobody. You are. Gee, she reads Bloom and she's in the School of Education. That's great. But anyway, I know education, not schools of education, departments of education, the public schools, the private schools, any kind of schools, well enough to know that any textbooks they had around in 1960, they still have around in 1970, because, they haven't used them up yet. And it takes quite a long while for changes to occur. So it may be that children being raised today will have less sense of trust in the president, then transform to the presidency than was true 20 years ago. But on the other hand, American adults have for a long time managed to shield our young from what many of us consider to be the sordid facts of politics. And it well may be that a majority of young people will continue to believe that the government usually knows what is best for the country. Now, among the things that we haven't taught them is that group influence is tremendously important in political matters. The children interviewed in the early 1960s were given the following list: rich people, labor unions, the president, newspapers, churches, policemen, big companies, and, quote, the average person, unquote. They were then asked to indicate how much these people or groups help decide which laws are made for the country. According to 8th graders, those who were most influential were the president by a very wide margin, then labor unions, newspapers, the average person, churches, big companies, rich people, and policemen. Now, do you believe it was or is honest to teach our children that the average person is politically more influential than churches, big companies, and rich people? An interesting footnote is that it was the upper middle class children of high intelligence who most overrated the effectiveness of the individual. A psychologist who participated in this survey called this the personal clout illusion. It was young people of that background who dominated the campus radical movements of the late 1960s. One of the distinguishing marks of the movement was its emphasis on participatory democracy. One reason the movement failed was that the students didn't understand the value and power of group organization and refused to establish any. Nor has the following generation acquired any greater understanding of the political process. I read a newspaper feature story not long ago about students at Kansas State University. One of them was quoted as saying that young people had tried mass action and it had failed, so now they are returning to individual action. And that student has still not grasped the difference between mass action and organized group action. Excuse me a minute. We adults have also overemphasized consensus and we've played down conflict when we discuss political matters with our children. We let them believe that the best man wins, and that all good citizens then dutifully get in line and support him wholeheartedly. A majority of 8th graders in the study I have been citing said that it would be bad for the country if the Democrats and the Republicans disagreed on important things. David Easton believes that the turmoil which disrupted and disabled so many college campuses and boiled out into the streets in the late 1960s arose at least in part from the students' pure shock upon discovering that their oversimplified and over-idealized view of the political process did not square with the facts. He likens the trauma to that of the Victorian maiden who never quite recovered in adulthood from the experiences of her wedding night. We have largely overcome sexual prudery in raising children, Easton says, but we are still trying to protect them from what we consider to be the sordid facts of politics. Now, certain expressions of the political process are sordid, witness Watergate, but the process itself is not. People characteristically do make use of power and influence in order to advance their particular and often competing interests. Why shouldn't children learn early, since that's when they establish their attitudes toward the regime, that conflict and not consensus is endemic to our system? Why shouldn't they view political action as an effort to resolve conflict? Why shouldn't they know that in resolving conflict, organized groups are often more have more effect, or more effective on the political decision-making scene than individuals are? Mark Krug, who's a University of Chicago professor in the School of Education, has said that the struggle of men for power is interesting and dramatic, and it ought to be the core of civics education. Now, a lot of people believe that the presence of pressure groups in our society is something to be ashamed of. Pressure groups, however, magnify the power of individuals who support the aims of the group. So it seems to me that the situation that thoughtful citizens should seek to avoid is domination by a particular pressure group, not the elimination of pressure groups per se, or the glossing over of their legitimate role in the political arena. It has been estimated that no more than 25% of Americans participate in either partisan political or nonpartisan, but nevertheless political action groups like the League of Women Voters. These participants tend to be upper-class, well-educated, upper-income people, not the Archie Bunkers or other so-called middle Americans. In 1963, a study was made of the high school civics courses in 3 Boston area school districts, each of them distinctive because of the socioeconomic background of its residents. In only one of these districts, the highest in socioeconomic level and also in the degree of political activism among its residents, did textbooks and instruction indicate to some degree that politics is a process for resolving group conflict. When community leaders, school administrators, and teachers were asked whether they considered this theme appropriate for the curriculum, 72% said they did. But in a school district populated by a middle to lower class and politically inert population, only 32% answered the question affirmatively. And in the school district characterized as predominantly working class, only 25% of both community leaders and school people said it was appropriate to teach children that finding solutions to group conflict is as important a feature of our political system as the individual citizen's right and responsibility to cast his solo vote. And as a matter of fact, we aren't even doing a very good job of teaching our children that half of the civics lesson. All you have to do is read the figures published in the newspapers after each election day, the figures that indicate the percentage of voters who did not go to the polls. Now, some observers of the social scene ascribe voter apathy to a sense of powerlessness in the face of big government, and the absence of engagement in civic affairs, to high mobility or residence in an urban center where a sense of community is lacking. But there was recently a survey done by a Chicago newspaper of people who live in a number of smallish Chicago suburbs, and this showed that even in this environment, the majority don't interest themselves in civic affairs. The degree of citizen participation in village affairs varied greatly in different suburbs, but on the average, more than a third of those questioned didn't know the name of their mayor or village president, and nearly 75% could not name two of their trustees or aldermen or whatever the title was. Fewer than 30% had ever attended a meeting of the village board or the city council. In one suburb, one called Northbrook, if any of you know it, only 1% of the registered voters had gone to the polls in that town's 1969 municipal election, and in more recent years, no more than 10% have voted. The record in some of the other suburbs was better, but in none of them had there been more than a 40% turnout for any recent village election. So I end these remarks with a question rather than a conclusion. Do you believe that a change in the way parents and then schools introduce very young children to our political system would create an adult citizenry with both more understanding of and more interest in participating in the affairs of government? Now, anybody who wants to make a rebuttal speech may do so. We can have general conversation, whatever you'd like, but I have to blow my nose first. Now, some of you ought to be experts. You ought to be more up to date than I on this whole business of child development. So what's been happening since 1960 that bears on this business of political legitimacy? What do you think is going to be the outcome of the 1960s? Are we still teaching children that politics is dirty, and that conflict is all wrong, and that everybody should agree with everybody else all the time? Or you want to argue with me on that point? Who is he?
Robert Reaven. He's a sociologist who writes on political socialization. I can't remember the name of the book.
Can you all hear her? Good.
He said that it's not what we teach, it's how we teach it. And as long as we teach in an authoritarian fashion, when the teacher in front of the room and the kids passively receiving whatever we teach, we are teaching acceptance of an authoritarian style.
That's how I've been teaching today. Shall we all get down together and sit in a circle? Yeah. But that's not quite the same. Authoritarianism is not quite the same as teaching what I consider to be, obviously what I consider to be, basic facts about the political regime, or the political process, really, in this country. Because I really do think this business of conflict, we dodge. We're just afraid to tell children that the candidates are going to hate each other the morning after the campaign just as much as they did before. Or at least they're going to undercut each other. And that political parties, it's true, both of our political parties do tend to go into the center. If they don't, they're cooked. I mean, it's the center that elects. But there still are differences. Why not bring these out, either in parental conversation or in the school textbooks? And how important is television? You know, that's the thing that I'm curious about. Do you think that the events of the 60s and the early 70s have made, don't any of you teach school? Have any of them made any difference in the preschool child's and the very young child's attitude toward the government? I don't have any grandchildren or young children, so I can't test this out myself. but I'd surely like to know if they still, little kids, still venerate first the president and then the presidency as much as this 1960 survey showed. What do you think?
My sister deals with first graders in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the town I grew up in, and I think it still has a very small town feeling, even though it's a larger community. And she said that the children over and over have asked her this school year, why does the president tell lies?
Mm-hmm.
And she said she could hear how many times different children asked her that. It wouldn't have hurt the other child talked to her about it. And the thing that really seemed to upset them was the word the lie,
Mm-hmm.
which has a big symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
But it would seem to me that all of these children would have to be affected by the hours of television.
Yeah.
It seemed much more so than those in this early 60s survey.
That's right.
Certainly, you can't keep it from them.
Yeah.
I think you used to be able to.
Of course, I guess any psychologist would say that the reason that the president is held in such veneration is, of course, because he stands as a father figure. I mean, he is an extension of father. And I certainly remember this, and I'm sure all the rest of you do, the stunning shock when Kennedy was assassinated that one felt. Here was a man who was a lot younger than I, who shouldn't have been a father figure at all. But again, it was this developed in infancy, in young childhood, attitude toward the president as a very special person. The president, partly, well, really it was the presidency, the symbol of the presidency, and the sense of loss. And then, of course, there were a lot of psychiatric papers written afterwards studying children's reaction to this, and it was tremendously traumatic for them. But even for adults, it's this quick sense of personal loss that you couldn't explain because it was wholly irrational. It has to go back to the very early years of learning, I think. You're saying you think the English have a much deeper sense of loyalty toward royalty, that is the Queen as the personification of... Yeah, but what these papers seem to say is that this is what we may do as adults, but the reason that we are fundamentally loyal to the regime is because of this extreme devotion toward it that we build up in young childhood. I mean, that we can go ahead and take after Nixon or Wilson or Roosevelt or whoever it is that we are convinced has done something wrong, or whose attitudes we don't like. If we can't we either turn them out of office or we criticize them in the press or something. But this doesn't happen in childhood. This happens later. And that the whole structure of the country, the political solidity of the country, is built on these very positive childhood attitudes. This, incidentally, is said to be true in all the Western countries. I had reason to talk to a young sociologist about 6 months or so ago on the general subject of when children establish these attitudes, and he says they're doing similar surveys in France. And they are finding out that children develop their attitudes toward the regime in France precisely on the same timetable as they do in these studies in the United States. But he doesn't know one done in Britain. I didn't say it real loud. No, not really. That the fundamental underlying attitudes never change. This is what makes our government legitimate, what makes us attached to it, what makes us forgive, what makes us feel a great loss when a president is assassinated, that this all goes back to these very early years of political socialization. But that as mature people, one can become very cynical about the particular derelictions within this political process without rejecting the legitimacy of the system. And this is what concerns me, and what I was talking about today is, will the events of the last 15 years alter the basic underlying development, early development of this sense of trust in the political system itself? What do you think?
I have an example from a 4-year-old in approximately 66 or 67. We had an exchange students from Chesapeake Institute in Alabama.
Yeah. Can you all hear? Why don't you come up here and talk into the mic? Or else stand up there.
We had this department of child development students from Chesapeake Institute in Alabama, and when we were leaving, one of the 4-year-olds said to one of the girls, "Be careful when you go back home, because your president back home is a bad man." And she was thought she was correcting his political understanding, and said, "We have a governor who's on vacation in Alabama, and our president is the same in Georgia. But it's the governor that we have." And he said, "Well, the governor is the bad man." And she said, "Our governor that we have now in Alabama is a woman." And this 4-year-old said, "Oh, but he tells her what to do. Everybody knows that."
Yeah. Yeah. And this was a 4-year-old. You see, terribly much more sophisticated, I think, than they were 20 or so years ago. And speaking of that same thing, there were 2 studies that I know of on children's use of language and vocabulary development, which happened to be done at the University of Minnesota. One of them in the 1930s sometime, and another one in the late 1950s, which used, of course, it's not exactly the same population, but still in all, in Minneapolis, you know, there's a tremendous similarity over the generations in the kind of people that live, and they use the same schools. And so they had a fairly similar group that they were dealing with, and they were studying vocabulary development in children. And they found that the 1950s group used much longer sentences, much bigger words, and knew a heck of a lot more than the same age group in the 30s, and could ascribe it only to 2 things. One, the development of the more permissive home, in which parents do not say, "You go put your rubbers on," but say, "Dear, you have to put your rubbers on because it's raining outside, and if you get your feet wet, you might catch a cold," you know, all this business, which requires much more word usage when you have to explain and be rational. So that was one. And the second one was television. That these 2 things alone would explain this great increase in the preschool child's ability to use language and vocabulary. The first one was permissive homes. The second one was television. You know, that the fact that they sat and listened to words, you see, for so much longer. And of course, it's been well authenticated now that very young children know a great deal more in terms of factual knowledge about the world, thanks to television, than they ever did in my generation. Well, shall we quit? Yeah. You say that you think it hasn't? This was just once. I see. Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe this one probably asked the children to talk. I mean, you know, they didn't just sit and listen to them talk, but probably, I don't know the details of it, probably asked them to describe things or something. So they could have picked up the language even if they weren't using it themselves. And that's only the one I know about. But it's true, it is a terrifically passive sport.
Do you have any thoughts about what the effects would be on our activity results if children are doing more critical analysis of the government?
Do I have any thoughts as to what the effect? Well, obviously I'm biased. I think it would be a great idea. How many of you know some of the work that has come out of the Elkhart experiment at Purdue? There's a wild Hungarian who used to be there, named Lawrence something or other, who then went to Boulder, who's an economist. And his theory is that very young children, first and second graders, can learn economics perfectly well. So he's done a whole bunch of books, one of which includes, at the second grade level, a simply dandy account of taxes. You know, what are taxes? What are they for? And stuff like that. And his theory is there's no reason why you can't teach this kind of thing perfectly well to young children. And of course, you know, who is it? Jerome Bruner? No, Bruner. Who's Bruner? What's his first name? He's the one that says you can teach any child anything, anytime, if you find the right language. Many people will dispute that, but I think fundamentally you probably can. And it certainly is true that very young children understand concepts, like this up-down business, that they could never verbalize. You've all seen that. That they've got ideas about space-time and all kinds of things of this sort, and understand that although they couldn't feed it back to you in terms of language, and they certainly couldn't spell it, but they begin to get clued in much younger than we think they are, because they can't use the language to indicate as much, but they certainly do understand a lot that we don't give them credit for. Well, let's quit. It's 3 o'clock. That's enough, huh?
I'd like to thank you all for coming and remind you there are more lectures to come. One tonight at 8 o'clock in Kildy, one tomorrow exactly the same time here, and another one tomorrow night in Kildy.
Oh, I want to tell any of you who are interested in corn and know a little bit about genetics, come here. My husband tonight, he's dreamy.
Thank you.
But you have to know a little something about genetics. I don't. I'm going. Oh, you are? That's good.
My husband's in botany and plant paths, so I came to hear George a number of years ago.
Oh, you did? You're going to come here tonight?
Well, I have to go to a church meeting.
Oh.
Both of you tomorrow.
Oh, all right.
But I took the schedule of your lectures, gave it to our daughter, who's helping in a rich curriculum. It's great.
Yeah.
Her teacher, kids are first grade, Robin Child, adopted by Japanese, third to sixth grade. And the older teacher, who's the head teacher, wondered if there was any possibility you might be able to come out this week and use the class to prepare. She tries to make some of it, but she can't.
I don't think so. I don't think so. We've got, they just pack the schedule as they usually do. And I have a back problem which requires that I lie down in the middle of the afternoon, and I've already told them I have to do that. That's where I'm going now since we just came in. So I don't think so.
Your paper or the work of the man at Chicago was used in this last election by the Republican Party because we have political button collection that goes back to 1880, and no place else has there ever been a button that said re-elect the president with no name of the man.
Oh, is that right?
Before we went to talk about it in junior high here, I made a major search through this state trying to get a button that showed Nixon and Agnew.
Yeah.
And eventually the Republican chairman here got me one from Des Moines, which was from the election 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Not this year.
Yeah.
No
In other words,
place
they
in
put the
Agnew.
whole emphasis on
But
the
the only other
president.
comparison is I found a plate that I later sold to the Smithsonian Institute, which had 4 teddy bears walking to the White House. And the Papa Bear looked at the Mama Bear, and it's written on it, "We are going to the White House to see our president, who is kind and good and always does what he said he would."
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that went right along
Yeah,
with yours. He
yeah,
always did what
yeah,
he said he would.
right.
But you see, that was Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So the first time that we have seen that evolve
Yes.
politically since then was the last
Yeah.
election. And you know, now it's, if you question me, you're threatening the president.
Yeah, the issue of the institution of the presidency.
Yeah,
Well,
I
I'd
think
sure,
they must have looked at that
I'd
research.
really sure like to see what's going to happen, with this new generation.